2 weeks ago, I covered how President Trump's State Department sent out communiques to their embassies across the UK, Europe, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, as well as the heads of state in those countries, telling politicians to respect the wishes of their voters and decrease mass migration, end illegal migration, and stop censoring speech and applying standards of two-tier policing to the native population who complain about foreign criminals not just committing crimes in their country, but getting relatively lighter sentences than the people posting on social media about it. The embassy staff have been instructed to record these crimes committed by illegal immigrants, including the grooming gang scandal that has ravaged the UK, as well as acts of state-funded abortion, euthanasia, anti-white DEI hiring policies, and white flight, and they now consider these all to be human rights violations and an existential threat to the West. You can watch my coverage of that linked down in the description. The reason I'm making this video is because there are some updates, because the State Department's officials sat down for a moderated press briefing where they mogged the Australian, Canadian, and even UK governments, reiterating that it's not just about illegal migration. They consider mass legal migration and demographic displacement of white populations to be a human rights violation, and they are not budging on this issue. They are undoing decades of leftist propaganda that said that to deport unwanted foreigners, to reverse mass demographic change, was itself a kind of ethnic cleansing, but it's not ethnic cleansing to have all of those immigrants move into the country and push white people out of their ancestral homelands in the first place. We'll also mention President Trump's remarks on Somalia and the travel ban that has been applied and extended across the 19 countries that were already banned from legal routes into America, which is now looking to be extended to up to 30 countries, with the promise that Trump is going to end all third world migration into the US. So first, for this briefing with a senior State Department official on November the 24th, the moderator took questions from the press, but the State Department official began by saying, "Last Thursday evening, the State Department sent out a cable to our embassies in Europe, as well as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, requesting that those embassies begin collecting data and reporting on migrant-related crimes and human rights abuses facilitated by people of a migrant background. This is part of a broader refocusing of the human rights portfolio of the Department of State under President Trump and Secretary Rubio that aims to develop human rights without selectivity, without cherry-picking on partisan lines. And by that I mean addressing human rights concerns that previously were not addressed for various reasons, whether that be because they were politically incorrect or they weren't convenient to prevailing narratives. The Trump administration is very committed to addressing human rights concerns wherever and whenever they find them, and there's a particular concern, as the President and Secretary have stated over and over again, with mass migration crisis in Europe. And there's a particular concern, as the President and Secretary have stated over and over again, with the mass migration crisis into Europe. Part of that cable was also an instruction to all of our embassies in Europe, as well as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, to engage the government to let them know the United States' concerns surrounding mass migration, and to let them know that the United States stands ready, willing, and able to support them in handling what we see as an existential crisis. Of course, this is a security concern for the US when its NATO partners and other members of Five Eyes are flooding themselves with third worlders and replacing members of the security services with said third worlders via anti-white DEI policies, and it makes them untrustworthy allies. This is why Vice President Vance joked at NatCon before becoming the Republican nominee for vice president last year, whether or not Britain will become a nuclear-armed Muslim country. This is a serious concern given the ethnic and sectarian politics boiling towards civil conflict in my country, and Americans are looking over at their allies and thinking, well, if we don't intervene now, it's going to become far too late to stay allied with you, and we're going to be standing alone. But also, there is a genuine affection by the employees of the Trump administration, who are our guys, who look at countries they like mine, like England, and think the motherland has fallen. Because, of course, America is England's best export and invention. And so they do really care more than our own governments. And this is putting the ball in their court. This is saying the Americans are happy to give you our blueprint for mass deportations, which have continued under the Trump administration, not quite to the rate that people would like, but they are getting blocked by the judiciary. And they have a hell of a hill to climb just to undo the at least 10 million illegals that the Biden administration brought in to demographically gerrymander the American electorate. But this says, we're willing to help you guys to solve your respective migrant crises. We're willing to share knowledge about how President Trump got border crossings down to zero within the first 100 days, how to reduce your legal immigration inflows. And we're willing to work with you. And if your voters want it, and you say you want it, like Keir Starmer and Shabana Mahmood, positioning themselves as getting tough on stopping the boats and reducing legal migration, then why won't you take their assistance? Are you all talk? Or do you actually want to get some action done? So this is a welcome intervention by the State Department on behalf of the besieged British public who have been betrayed by this and successive governments for decades now. The official said, "I'm sure you all saw the tweet thread we put out simultaneously, and I would just like to reiterate what that tweet thread says, which is that mass migration is an existential threat to Western civilization and the safety of both the West and the world. We are particularly concerned not only about the violation of national sovereignty, which is in itself already an egregious violation of basic rights and the rights of sovereign citizens in these countries, but also human rights abuses and what we see as very egregious human rights concerns surrounding mass migration and the facilitation of mass migration. To translate, they are concerned about the crimes and costs incurred by accommodating millions of migrants from the third world who disproportionately commit sex and violent crime and drain the treasury of taxpayer cash. But also, they're concerned about demographic displacement and the crowding out of the democratic process of the native population by large numbers of immigrants moved into towns and cities, which then act as client groups for whichever government or party brought them in the first place. And so they are saying, we are concerned about the deprioritization, the being made a second-class citizen in your own country for Indigenous Europeans and white Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders. The official said, to go through a couple of these concerns, the foremost of these is sexual assault. If you look at Europe, for example, and various countries in Europe, there are concerning increases that we're seeing in sexual assaults and violent, aggravated attacks, particularly on women and young girls, by people of a migration background, particularly people of extremist Islamic background as well. Just Muslim. The official references the Pakistani grooming gangs and then says, we see instances of human trafficking, anti-Semitic and anti-Christian attacks, largely by people of radical Islamic backgrounds. That's an important addition because until now the Trump administration have conspicuously only made anti-Semitism a primary policy concern. But it's been J.D. Vance and now members of the State Department, working under Secretary Rubio, who have been raising attacks on Christians, both violent and their persecution by the state for praying silently outside abortion facilities, as a human rights concern, as something the Trump administration wants to stop in our countries. So I appreciate the Trump administration safeguarding Christians overseas in this way. It matters just as much if white Christians are being persecuted in England as it does if black Christians are being persecuted in Nigeria. And unfortunately, we don't have a Nicki Minaj to speak up for us over here in Blighty, so I'm glad the State Department is keeping a close eye on it and putting pressure on our governments to stop doing this. Most damningly, speaking of pressure on the Starmer government, the official said, on top of that, the government response, we're concerned about what we see as two-tiered justice, where migrants and the crimes that are committed by migrants often receive much more lenient punishments than equivalent behaviours by local populations. Or, actually, far less egregious non-violent crimes by natives get harsher sentences than the violent crimes committed by immigrants. An example of this is an Eritrean illegal migrant staying in an asylum hotel sexually assaulted a 19-year-old girl with learning difficulties and only got 14 months and served no additional prison time because his time on remand was counted as time served, whereas Lucy Connolly fired off an imprudent and then deleted tweet in the aftermath of the Southport murders and got 31 months in prison after being coerced into pleading guilty by bad government-funded legal advice and a court that was working round the clock at Keir Starmer and Lord Hermer's instructions to lock up far-right racists, people that complained about immigrants committing crimes against their children. This is a real problem, the official said. There are security implications to this, there are cultural implications, there are economic implications, and I think it's about time that for the sake of our allies, for the sake of their citizens, for the sake of our friends, someone said something about this. And at the same time, the negligence on this issue, the mass migration crisis, by the human rights community, by the international community, has been glaring. The United Nations care an awful lot about the plight of people in third world shitholes, but not about the white girls being abused by Pakistanis here in Britain. And that oversight is deliberate. And so the United States is ready, willing, and able to help end that, the official said, end the scourge of mass migration and help our allies as best we can. But in order to do that, you need to start treating this phenomenon as the problem that it is, and that's what we're doing. He also makes one more note. Some people might be conflating the mass migration cable communique with the human rights reporting communique cable that came out a little earlier in the day on Thursday. He wants to note these are two distinct cables. The human rights reporting cable, which does now include, among other additions, reporting requirements on mass migration as part of our coverage of human rights concerns in countries around the world, is distinct from the migration cable, which is more particular and goes into more detail. That was the cable that was sent to the Starmer government, which said, stop two-tier policing and end mass migration. Whereas the cable that was sent to the embassies only instructed embassy staff to 1. Encourage the government to make good on their promises to end mass migration, and 2. Record the crimes committed by immigrants to then include in the annual human rights reports. That is a statutory duty via various pieces of legislation that the State Department has to provide to Congress for each of the nations they have embassies in or significant ties to via aid or trade. Then the moderator began reading out questions from the press, and they started with the typical excuse of, isn't immigration good for the economy? Quote, immigration is a major driver of economic activity in Western countries. How does the US view the balance between encouraging immigration that boosts economic growth and setting hard limits to prevent mass migration? This is untrue. In Britain, ever since the Boris wave, 95% at least of immigrants that come over every single year are net tax detriments. If you look at the data from Denmark and the Netherlands, you'll see that MENAPT migrants from the Middle East, North Africa, Pakistan, and Turkey are never net tax contributors across their lifetime. Additional data from the UK, as of the Boris wave, also shows now that Indian and Nigerian immigrants, the so-called high-skilled striver immigrants from those parts of the world, they are now earning less than the average British salary, meaning they aren't the promised GDP rocket fuel either. The official cleverly sidestepped this attempt to position mass migration as an unalloyed economic good and said, it's a great question and obviously there's nuance to this issue. I would return to the president's comments when it comes to immigration that supports economic growth. He was talking about it in the context of, recently, of South Korea and the need to bring certain high-skilled workers, a very small select group that can help upskill US workers and help train them in complex tasks so that they can become sufficient and grow the US workforce's capacity. That's an example of immigration that can be useful. And there's no one in the Trump administration that's saying, carte blanche, all immigration at all times, in all places, is bad. Very few people have problems with a handful of Japanese businessmen visiting, for example. That is a wholly distinct issue completely from what we're seeing happen in Europe and across the developed world with the mass migration crisis. This is not economic migration. Or maybe it's economic migration for the people coming in, but as far as economic benefits, the claims that mass migration is economically beneficial across the board is completely dubious. In fact, when you talk to people on the ground, these local populations who are often being displaced out of their houses, that are having their jobs taken, that are seeing their communities degraded, when they're seeing crime spike, when they're seeing their children attacked, I don't want to speak for them per se, but it doesn't seem to me that the economic benefits are there. And so while there is certainly a place for that type of migration, the phenomenon we're talking about here is completely different. I really appreciate the level of clarity that this State Department official spoke with to repudiate that tired old narrative that we need immigrants to sustain the economy because there are other considerations beyond the fact that it's not an economic good, and those should be balanced against it, and typically, especially in my country, don't count in its favour. I appreciate that there's someone at the State Department who understands these issues and has the back of the British public, while its treacherous politicians and media apparatchiks continue to quack away this repudiated line like duck speak. I don't care if immigration is an unalloyed economic good, if it's degrading my culture and causing an increase in crime. I would rather sustain economic hardship and remain the same people and not have children be put at risk than grow the GDP at the expense of my culture and children's lives. Then a journalist from The Telegraph asked about Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood's announcements concerning illegal and legal migration, and what the State Department meant by being willing to help European allies deal with mass migration. And the official said, "What I'll say about the UK is that, of course, it's encouraging when you hear British politicians recognise the mass migration crisis is real, that it's a real issue for their citizens. That's a step forward, because there are a lot of politicians and governments in Europe that are tending not to think or not to call this out for what it is." Unfortunately, I don't think the State Department official realises that Shabana Mahmood only wants to be seen to be getting tough on mass migration, because illegal migration and mass legal migration is calling into question the multicultural settlement that makes her position in Parliament as a Pakistani Muslim woman who demands you recognise her as being English increasingly untenable. She said in Parliament she's only dealing with this because she gets called racial slurs, something that I don't encourage anyone do, by the way, but she didn't care about demographic displacement or the crimes committed against white Brits. She now only cares when the public have criticism about immigration policy because of that displacement and those crimes, and that criticism reflects badly on her, not just as a member of the government, but as a Pakistani Muslim woman, a member of the ethnic and religious group disproportionately responsible for these heinous crimes that have been covered up for decades. The official continues, "I will note, with the British government in particular, time and again, we've seen governments, whether it be Conservative governments, Labour governments, say they're going to take action to solve the mass migration crisis, and time again, despite the people continuously voting for a resolution or at least some sort of relief from the pressures of mass migration, nothing has really happened." And so that's something that I know that the British people are definitely concerned about and worried about, and it's something that the United States it's a concern the United States shares with them. As far as collaborating with British colleagues, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labour has always held dialogues with allied countries about best practices when it comes to democracy, human rights particularly. I wouldn't say we recategorize, but finally recognize, as this administration is, the human rights implications of mass migration. It's definitely an issue set that we're going to be bringing to various dialogues that we have on human rights with our allies. We would welcome a dialogue with the United Kingdom on this. We would hope that they would want to come to the table to put our heads together on solutions. I wouldn't hold my breath. And just like we have time and time again over history, or over the history of our two countries, I think we can find a solution. But they need to be willing to come to the table and be serious about finding solutions. Then a journalist from the Sydney Morning Herald in Australia asked, "So sorry, can I just clarify?" And this is definitely not limited to illegal immigration. This is the concern by the US government that other governments are running a legal migration program that is too big. And the State Department official said, "Right, I mean, obviously, illegal migration is the elephant in the room, but mass migration more broadly is a concern in itself. Obviously, we know there are good people out there. America has its history as one of many great people coming in the legal way, assimilating into American culture and contributing. The president has been very clear that he supports that kind of immigration, but you have to have some common sense about that. And you also have to understand the limitations, the very practical limitations, and also the security concerns that come with mass migration, and what happens when you import a substantial number of people into a very tight particular area. There are very real concerns and ramifications that come out of that. One of the ramifications that they had already discussed was the pressure on housing in Australia. It's adorable the Australians are only at the housing and public services stage of immigration discourse. I'm sure they'll catch up to Britain talking about culture, identity, and remigration soon enough. The State Department official said, "We're watching the housing issues in Australia. Beyond that, we just want to caution the Australians. We love the Australian people. We love Australia. As a country, it's a great ally, and so we just want to warn our friends that if you import a rapid number of individuals of any background, but particularly individuals of a culture that's radically different than Australia's without any sort of mechanism for diffusing the impact, that can lead to political unrest, that can lead to economic instability. And so we definitely want to be aware of that. I too love Australia, just as I love America, just as I love Japan. I don't want to see any of those countries demographically swamped, culturally terraformed, riddled with crime and economic privation, because the native populations are having to foot the bill for tribal, anti-white immigrants coming into their country and treating immigration as a form of colonization, revenge for perceived slights by the white world against Africa, the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent. I don't want to see that happen to the rest of the Anglosphere any more than I do my country, and I'm glad the State Department shares this view. Finally, a Canadian journalist asked whether or not the State Department has any views on Canada's specific immigration policies, and asked, so should only Anglo-Christians and nobody from Africa and the Middle East be allowed in? And the State Department official responded, what we're trying to say is that we're not here to determine a country's immigration policy for it. Obviously, the United States was built with many, many great immigrants who assimilated into the culture, who contributed to the United States, who wanted to be Americans, who were patriotic, who were part of this country and its history. Again, largely European Christians. What we're trying to caution is, I think, twofold. One is concerns about the rapid importation of large quantities of people, regardless of their background, whether they're from France, whether they're from Africa, whether they're from the Middle East, into a particular place, regardless of their ethnic background. That's going to put strains on the system. And so that in itself is a concern. Obviously, illegal migration in itself is a matter of sovereignty, and law and order is an issue of concern. And then on the cultural side, we're not here to make adjudications particularly, but when there are people who are radical Islamists coming into a country who subscribe to an ideology that is diametrically opposed to the ideas of democratic self-government that Canada, the United States, and I believe of most of Europe claim to represent, that's an issue, right? And so we're hoping that governments will scrutinise those types of factors much more. We're not telling them how they should govern in particular, or how their policies should look, but to pretend like certain strains of Islam or certain radical strains of other ideologies don't have negative impacts on the country, that's just blatantly false, and it's a disservice to the citizens of those countries that are going to be impacted by it. This coincided with Secretary Rubio getting rhetorically firm on the impact on jihadist terror and mass Muslim migration into Europe and America, especially in the aftermath of the shooting of 2 National Guards members, one of whom tragically died aged 20, by another Afghan who was let in by the Biden administration, who apparently shouted Allahu Akbar. Secretary Rubio said, radical Islam has shown their desire is not simply to occupy one part of the world and be happy with their own little caliphate. They want to expand. It's revolutionary in its nature. It seeks to expand and control more territories and more people. That's a clear and imminent threat to the world and the broader West, but especially the United States, who they identify as the chief source of evil on the planet. And so it's encouraging that the Trump administration has begun to designate certain chapters of the Muslim Brotherhood as international foreign terrorist organizations. This executive order, signed on the 24th of November, designates Muslim Brotherhood chapters in Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt as international terror organizations. A senior leader of the Egyptian chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood on October 7th, 2023, called for violent attacks against the United States partners and interests, and Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood leaders have long provided material support to the militant wing of Hamas. Also, the Lebanese chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood joined Hamas, Hezbollah, and Palestinian factions to launch multiple rocket attacks against both civilian and military targets within Israel. I hope this is a stepping stone, not just to protect Israel's territorial integrity, but instead that the eye is trained on Muslim Brotherhood chapters operating in the UK, Europe, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, because the UK has been recognised as one of the headquarters of many Muslim Brotherhood organisations, such as the Muslim Council of Britain, according to a 2015 UK government report, and Islamic Relief, according to the Emiratis, who have banned a number of Muslim Brotherhood front groups from operating in their country, and journalists from that country have said, we have more Muslim Brotherhood members in the UK than in many Muslim countries, and now lots of wealthy Emiratis don't want to send their offspring to the UK in case they get radicalised. I think it would be great for the State Department to put pressure on our governments to prescribe them, finally, as domestic terror organisations and international terror organisations, but also, if possible, make it a condition of our various bilateral military agreements, make it a condition of NATO membership, to ban these groups, which are just as much a threat as any other military group that NATO purports to defend against. And then we get onto Donald Trump's incredible Thanksgiving Day post. Print it, frame it, hang it in the Louvre. Now, it has been pointed out by Trump's right-wing critics that if he can talk like this all the time, why doesn't he? If he knows what the problem is with mass third world migration, why didn't he ban it earlier. If he can pull the lever on this rhetoric, why was he telling Laura Ingraham on Fox News that America needs 600,000 Chinese students to prop up historically black colleges, why it needs H-1B Indians because Americans just aren't skilled enough? But let's just hope the president's been listening to his base, which is why he's calling Governor Walz a retard for allowing thousands of Somalians to scam the generous payments made to autistic children by faking an autism diagnosis. Trump wrote, as an example, hundreds of thousands of refugees from Somalia are completely taking over the once great state of Minnesota. Somalian gangs are roving the streets looking for prey as our wonderful people stay locked in their apartments and houses, hoping, against hope, that they will be left alone. The seriously retarded governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, does nothing, either through fear, incompetence, or both, while the worst congresswoman man in our country, Ilhan Omar, always wrapped in her swaddling hijab and who probably came to the USA illegally in that you are not allowed to marry your brother, does nothing but hatefully complain about our country, its constitution, and how badly she is treated. When her place of origin is a decadent, backward, and crime-ridden nation which is essentially not even a country for its lack of government, military, police, schools, etc. This is factual, by the way. Academic Patrick Nash, who was tracing the rates of cousin marriage in Muslim countries, couldn't find out the rate of cousin marriage in Somalia because they don't keep records because they're that much of a failed state. So, President Trump then announced, even as we have progressed technologically, immigration policy has eroded those gains and living conditions for many. I will permanently pause migration from all third world countries to allow the US system to fully recover, terminate all of the millions of Biden illegal admissions, including those signed by Sleepy Joe Biden's autopen, and remove anyone who is not a net asset to the United States or is incapable of loving our country, end all federal benefits and subsidies to non-citizens of our country, denaturalize migrants who undermine domestic tranquility, and deport any foreign national who is a public charge, security risk, or non-compatible with Western civilization. These goals will be pursued with the aim of achieving a major reduction in illegal and disruptive populations, including those admitted through an unauthorized and illegal autopen approval process. Only reverse migration can fully cure this situation. Other than that, happy Thanksgiving to all, except those that hate, steal, murder, and destroy everything that America stands for. You won't be here for long. DHS Secretary Kristi Noem then followed up with that she met with the president and is recommending a full travel ban on every damn country that's been flooding our nation with killers, leeches, and entitlement junkies. Our forefathers built this nation on blood, sweat, and the unyielding love of freedom, not for foreign invaders to slaughter our heroes, suck dry our hard-earned American tax dollars, or snatch the benefits owed to Americans. We don't want them, not one. Now, as people have pointed out in the comments, if this doesn't include India, and I would add Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, China, most of Africa, for that matter, if it doesn't include all those countries, then it's not a ban on all third world migration. And so far, even though the Department of Homeland Security account has promised every damn country, their policy memorandum only targets the 19 countries already subjected to a travel ban by President Trump earlier this year. It does place on hold all applications for asylum and withholding of removal, DACA, regardless of the country of origin, pending a comprehensive review. So this does stop all asylum applications from being processed. It does stop all deferred action from being processed, and so will expedite the number of people that can be removed from the country. Noem has also reversed course on her claiming on Fox News that they are processing a record number of green cards and citizenship grants by halting all citizenship recognition ceremonies for the following 19 countries that have already been banned from traveling to the US or have their visas restricted. And these include Sierra Leone, Togo, Chad, Libya, Sudan, Eritrea, Equatorial Guinea, Burundi, the Congo, Yemen, Somalia, Myanmar, Laos, Iran, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Cuba, Haiti, and Venezuela. There are lots of countries missing from that list that provide no benefit whatsoever to the American taxpayer, that are far too culturally distant from America to ever integrate in any meaningful way to American life, that hold long-standing ethnic grudges against whites and will undoubtedly enact those if they are allowed to enter your government and even your political system. See what Wajahat Ali thinks about white people, and he comes from Pakistan, for example. So I think there needs to be an extensive update to this list, and it seems that Secretary Noem is planning to expand it to at least 30 countries, with further announcements forthcoming. There have already been restrictions placed on Nigeria for the Muslim government there's unwillingness to prevent the ongoing genocide of Christians by Fulani herdsmen. Let's hope that more countries are added to this list so that America doesn't have to suffer mass Indian or mass Pakistani migration anymore. The reason I made this segment is not just to update all of you, because you seem to appreciate this news that comes between our respective sides of the Atlantic, but because I want to say the Trump administration is doing good things, and it's doing good things for us in Britain, Europe, Canada, Australia, even New Zealand to the extent that they get migration. We appreciate it, and so I want the Trump administration to be just as forceful on migration in its own borders as it is keen to be to enforce Britain's borders too.